driving the van. Really? But if you taught him soon enough, he might still have some items.
They got him 2 days later and they did a search. They wrote a letter to the mayor. But and then hiding from my
So, okay, Irish. We'll still do it together.
yeah, no.
Okay.
It's kind of like my hand.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate it, but I've done it.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
I just wanted to make sure.
I appreciate it. That's super nice.
So was it most of your husband's equipment?
It's ours.
Right.
I bought it.
Right.
But yeah, I mean these.
I love this. So you have to. So do you think it can help?
So the other item is like longer trip, and it's almost Black Friday. So
I know, but it's still unnecessary stuff that you have to deal with that you shouldn't have to.
what's but I did learn that
I think I'd let your neighbors know what.
I went and talked
Yeah.
to them. I know my neighbors way better.
Right.
I was like, someone lending a
Yep. Well, now you all are watching for him. Bust into somebody's house and steals their stuff?
The people behind me, like, everyone around the flashlight. I contact that neighbor who's like,
No, it's not okay.
I can't.
Keep it in the neighborhood, huh? All right.
I don't know. It's been dramatic. I'm excited.
I get it.
That was okay. But that's why I didn't. I was like,
Pick your battles. Good evening, everyone. So I want to welcome you to Neighbors Church tonight. So we are going to talk about pronouns, respect, and responsibility, and honoring identities. We have a guest speaker tonight. Her name is Mal Chalani, and she is a friend of mine and a superhuman being. And she's actually a social scientist and will be able to answer any questions. If you want to ask the questions towards the end after her program's over, she'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. So if we can give a round of applause to Mal.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Julianne. Julianne is also a fabulous, amazing human being, so I'm sure you all know. As Julianne shared, my name is Mal Chalani. My pronouns are she or they, which for some of you may be new. Some of you maybe have done some identity work before, but that is kind of where I got started. So I'm going to talk about myself first, because when I do this kind of work, I like to use myself as an example, so I'm not targeting anybody else, outing anybody, or sharing things that maybe aren't things that people would be comfortable with. So my name is Mal. I'm from Colorado originally. I moved to Nebraska in 2017 with my now spouse. I am a gender non-conforming, non-binary person who identifies more on the feminine end of our trans rainbow here. We'll get into all of that. Don't worry. Going to learn a lot. I'm a pansexual individual. I do happen to be married to a man. Of all choices, what one to make? My life partner, who is also a pansexual individual. I work right now at Spreetail doing social science data analytics, and I am in my dissertation year for, let's see, what's the least boring way to say? I study the queer problems, right? So what I look at is, what is the experience of queer people at work, basically? Looking at those intersections and understanding what are the challenges, the barriers. How can we make sure that folks like me and like so many folks in the United States and across the world have a fair shake at building a great life, which really can start in our communities and also in our workspaces. So that's a lot of what I look at. And I'm open to any questions about myself. So as you think of questions, there are no silly questions. You can save them for the end, but also please know that this is what I call a brave space. I like to say your ego is not your amigo, okay? So anything you want to ask, you don't need to be embarrassed. That's just your ego challenging you. You can ask me, and I will give you the most honest and correct answer that I can. So what is our purpose today? We are going to talk about pronouns, but really what is that besides word police? I've had people say that to me, don't word police me, I don't want to be word policed. It's not really about that. According to the Williams Institute, 1.4 million working age adults and many more youth identify as trans or non-binary in the United States. And so when we think about that volume of people, these are people that you meet or have met or will meet in your life. And they're not trying to police you in any way. They're really trying to share with you who they are. And that is a really great place to start, is to understand that this is not necessarily about correcting someone or being right all the time. It's about understanding the people in your life and realizing that when somebody is open with you about who they are, you should respect it, and it's one of the kindest things that they can do for you as well. So we're going to talk about identity. We're going to focus on gender and gender expression, but a lot of what we talk about in the concepts and the things that we consider today can be applied to different issues, different marginalized groups. We'll talk about some identity terminology, and then we'll just talk about how to create safe spaces, supportive spaces. It says workplaces because I made this for my work initially, but we're not at work. So just spaces in general. So our agenda, let's start with some terms. We're going to talk about DEIB. We're going to talk about how can we make those spaces. That yellow is hard to read, but it says how to approach those weird conversations you might have, because we all make mistakes all the time. And then a judgment-free Q&A. So I like to start with a quote from Alex Schmitter, who is the director of transgender representation at GLAAD, which says, proper use of gender identity terms, including pronouns, is a crucial way to show courtesy and acceptance, right? So it's not just about word police, which is what we really want to avoid. Holy cow, I have a lot of notes. Congrats to me. But it is about issues of equity and acceptance, right? So there are so many challenges to the rights, the right part of this, right? There is a whole politicized movement around transgenderism and non-binary individuals, which is a topic in the headlines, but it really is much deeper than that, and so that's what my work is always trying to move away from. All right, so terminology, you can read that, or I can read it to you, whatever works for you, but we're going to do a lot of terminology. This is the genderbread person, I don't know what we call it, but basically it helps you understand a little bit about when we talk about gender terminology, what are we pointing out. I actually really like the gender unicorn, if you have experienced this before. It's a little bit more youth-friendly, and also I enjoy cartoons. So, gender identity, when we talk about that, it's an internal concept, okay? So I think one thing that challenges people is we are very prone to making judgment as soon as we see something. I've worked really hard to move away from that, and part of what I've realized is for everyone, sometimes your insides and the way you feel aren't going to match your outsides. For most people, your gender identity matches the sex that you're assigned at birth. But for transgender people, it does not align with the sex that you're assigned at birth. So a lot of folks have a gender identity of man or woman or a boy or a girl, and for others, it does not even fit into that binary, and that's where I find myself lately. So I threw a lot of terms at you already about myself, but I've come out 3 times in my life. First time I came out, I was like, I'm gay. It's only gay if you only like the same gender, right? That's the homosexual. So I came out again later and I told my mom, you know what, I think I'm bi. And she was like, I don't know what that means. I'm a baby boomer. So we explained that. And then I realized, you know what, there are a lot of beautiful, great people who don't identify with a gender or maybe are transgender, and I also am attracted to them. So what I realized is that gender is not something that changes the way I feel emotionally or physically about somebody, so I am pansexual. Just talk about like a sandwich. You can put any toppings on the Lgbtq BLT and I will eat it, okay? That's the easiest way to think about it. And then as I was learning that about myself, what I realized is I don't really feel like gender is something that I identify with in any way. I identify with femininity most of the time, but I actually don't really feel like I conform to any kind of gender expression. So gender expression are those external manifestations of gender, right? So we have the internal, which is the identity, the external. These are masculine to feminine, although it changes over time, and honestly that varies by culture, right? Something that might be very femme is going to be masc in another culture. The other item on this side we talk about is sexual orientation. So the reason I walk you through my own story is because it's important not to confuse and conflate orientation and identity because they're not the same. So orientation is enduring physical, romantic attraction to other folks. Gender identity is your innate understanding of yourself. So they can be a little bit confusing, and that's totally okay. Just something to consider as you learn about individuals. So I think another interesting thing to consider is that just like everyone else, individuals who are transgender or non-binary can identify with an orientation. So they may be gay or straight or bi or pan, depending on how they orient in their sexuality. I'm going to take a pause and drink some water. I am very chatty, and how's the pace? Are we doing okay? Great. So I want to introduce an idea that I think is helpful for remembering some of these terms, which is called the Sogi Scale, and it really brings together those 4 items we just talked through. So what you can do is start to imagine, instead of a binary for all of these items, which is female, male, hetero, homo, woman, man, feminine, masculine. It's actually a spectrum across all of them. And every person, including you, falls somewhere on that spectrum for each one of these. And if you haven't thought about that yet, I think this is a great place to start with understanding your own identity before you can really start to appreciate the nuance of everyone else's. So it's called Sogi because S is for sex, so gender assigned or sex assigned at birth. The O is orientation. The G is gender identity, and then the E is for expression. So helpful to kind of put those terms in perspective with one another and to understand what we mean when we say a spectrum. All right, so terminology, additional. We have cisgender, we have transgender. Gosh, I have explained cisgender to so many cisgender people. It's pretty amazing, and you know what? I'm happy to do it because I feel like folks think of transgender as very othered, and they think, when you think that, and you don't think of there may be another conception for folks who don't identify as trans, you really are othering people. So let's say cis, and then we think about that spectrum, and in the middle, we have the non-binary. So cisgender, cis actually means on the same side as, and is the antonym of trans. So that's why we have cis and trans. So a cisgender person is someone who identifies with the gender they're assigned at birth. Very straightforward. A transgender person is someone who does not align with that. And so when we say a transgender person, it's different than saying, somebody is representing themselves. So you'll see a note here that it also is important to know that you can be trans or non-binary and represent in a million different ways through your gender expression. You can't look at someone and know if they're trans. And I realize that is a term that I'm bringing up here from my research, but it's also something I had to learn about myself. And as you go through your life, people are going to learn about themselves and really understand, I actually might be trans, I may be non-binary, and exploring what those feelings are and understanding who they are. I'm not used to this. So pretty fancy situation. So let's talk about transitioning. I do stand-up comedy, and I always like to make the joke that non-binary comedians don't segue, they transition. That's what we do. Pretty good joke, if I say so myself. So when we talk about transition, we talk about gender-affirming care, or GAC. And this is a process, and something that's in the news a lot right now, I know especially for our youth folks. So I think it's important, or our young folks, I think it's important to understand that there are a lot of different transitions, and it is not always, traveling somewhere to have some kind of mystical surgery. There are three main ways that individuals transition, and going through one or zero or all three of them do not make you any more or less who you are. Those are all choices you get to make for yourself. So again, remembering that being transgender is not dependent on how you look, but sometimes it does increase folks' comfort in their bodies. So let's talk about the three different forms of transitioning. So we have a social transition. That is telling your friends and family and coworkers, sometimes coworkers. That is using a name that feels appropriate to you. So my full name is Mallory, and I'm not necessarily comfortable with that unless it's my immediate family, so everyone calls me Mal. It feels less gender specific, and that's really who I feel I am. It's also dressing differently, starting or stopping to wear makeup or jewelry or dresses or male typical or female typical outfits, those kinds of things. Then we have a legal transition, one of the hardest transitions to make, so changing your name and or your sex marker on documents. So that's things like your driver's license, your passport, your social security record, your bank accounts, things like that. Very challenging, especially in the United States, but there are some things that people are working on here, such as changing gender identifiers on licenses and things. So some to consider. And then the third is the medical transition, which a lot of that is not necessarily even surgical procedure. I would say that's maybe the least common that I've seen my friends go through. It's actually more hormone replacement. So you can feel who you are in your body and also not feel like your body is a foreign space to you. So, not to be exclusive, we're going to be inclusive here. Gosh, there are a lot of genders. There's a lot of genders out there. You can talk about female, male, bigender, agender, transgender, trans man, trans woman. Holy cow, there's a lot. And this is what I really mean when I say you really don't know unless someone tells you, right? And then when they share that with you, it is just essential that you're honoring them by knowing that they know who they are better than anyone else. So when we say transgender man, it is a man who was assigned female at birth who may use this term to describe himself. They may also refer to themselves as a trans man or man. That's what we do. There's also a transgender woman, so a woman who was assigned male at birth may use this term to describe herself. The same, trans woman, woman. What do you think the best way to learn how to talk about someone is? The correct answer is they will tell you, right? They will tell you. So something to consider is, not being assumptive and knowing that asking is okay. I think that's the other thing, and that's part of the ego. Folks want to protect themselves. They're like, I don't want to seem like a jerk. I don't want to do the wrong thing. The wrong thing is pretending you know it all or ignoring it entirely. So just go ahead and ask. And that's why I always, when I go to work sometimes, or moreover, when I talk about this stuff on stage, when I do comedy, I'll wear a button that says, ask me about my gender, because I want people to feel like they can. I have to remember to keep track of time, so tell me if I'm losing it totally. So then we have non-binary. So non-binary is an adjective used by people who experience their gender identity or gender expression outside of the binary. So though I say she, they as my pronouns, I definitely do not feel like I am entirely a woman. It's just not who I am, but also don't really feel like a man. So I go with non-binary because that's where I am. Many non-binary people also call themselves transgender and consider themselves part of the transgender community, and some others do not. They consider it something else entirely. And so you may hear different viewpoints on that. There's not a right way or a wrong way. It's just one's own self-perception. So when we talk about that, you can also consider other terminology, such as, and I don't want to mess them up, agender, bigender, demigender, pangender, etc. And that would describe something that falls under the non-binary umbrella. Then we also have gender non-conforming. Gosh, there's a lot of terms. Gender non-conforming, it means your gender expression differs from the conventional expectations of masculinity and femininity. I would say I am gender fluid, gender non-conforming. So much of the time, I may wear a dress and get very dressed up, but then the rest of the time, I might look like a 14-year-old skater boy. I don't know. I'm probably dressing too young, but simply having a non-conforming gender expression does not make you non-binary, right? We have our different components to our identity, but it's important to know that some folks may say they're gender non-conforming. It does not also mean that they're transgender. How's it going? Do you know? Yeah, I know. There's a lot. There's a lot. It's okay. So in order to practice, we're going to do a little activity, and this is where we let our egos go, because I have celebrities. Hooray for them and their selves. Some of them you may recognize, and some of them you may not, and I'm not going to make you do this as a group activity, because I know that you want to protect yourself. But I want you to walk through your thoughts as you think about each of these individuals. So the easy get, obviously, is George Clooney, so handsome, So more handsome, the more wrinkled. I don't understand it. What a lucky person. But think about, what is his sex assigned at birth? What is his sexual orientation? What is his gender identity? And what is his gender expression? I feel like George Clooney is an easy get because we know those things about him because of his celebrity, right? Does anybody know who this person next to George is? Lil Nas X, right. So anybody else? Is that a new, yeah, okay. We like Lil Nas X. I'm fine. I like him as a person, but I'm not into his music. But Lil Nas X, if you have not probably researched him, what do you know about him? Do you know his sex assigned at birth? Do you know his sexual orientation? Do you know his gender identity? Do you know his gender expression? I will share he is a man. He's gay. He identifies as a man, but he's actually gender neutral in his gender expression or gender non-conforming, right? So you will see Lil Nas X out there wearing a dress, wearing high heels, non-conforming, but he still very much considers himself a black, gay man. Then we have Elliott Page. I've got a big crush on Elliott Page. Elliott Page, seems like we're familiar. So Elliott is a non-binary, trans-masc, straight person. There's a lot happening there, especially since many of us knew Elliott before they transitioned, right? So there's new ways of thinking. And I think it's very brave that he would come out and they would, use both, they would be out in that way, considering it is very hard for a lot of folks to make a mental transition like that once you have come out as who you are. We also have Hunter Schaefer, another really great person, is a trans woman, actually pansexual, and has a feminine gender expression. We have Rihanna, is a female assigned at birth, straight woman who tends to be pretty feminine. And then we have Sam Smith, who identifies as queer as his sexuality, non-binary and genderqueer in his expression. So if you can imagine, if you didn't know these individuals, you might look at them and say, I'm so confused, right? And that's when pronouns come in, because that's when you get to start asking questions or sharing about yourself to encourage people to share with you. Something I like to highlight, oh gosh, sorry about the formatting there, is that there are culturally specific terms for gender diversity in history, throughout history, and in different cultures. And so the ones that I touch on are the ones I have experience with, but understanding that different cultures may be two-spirit. They may be someone from Oaxaca who talks about being, oh gosh, M-U-X-E. I'm terrible at pronouncing any of these, so I try not to because I want to be respectful. But knowing that, there are lots of different genders that have been recognized, so this is not new, even though sometimes when you watch the news, you're like, wow, all of this is new. It's not new, it's just way more public than it's ever been before. I have too many notes about that. We're not getting into those. So, terminology to avoid and best practices. I think this is pretty important, and this is where I think people start to really feel that word police. I would tell you, as whoever you are, wherever you are on any of these spectrums, if you're comfortable, if you hear someone do this inappropriately, the best thing you can do for trans and non-binary people is to speak up and correct folks easily, quickly, with no shaming, no judgment. So, for example, we have these phrases on the top left. So phrases like these, like born a man, born a woman, oversimplify how complex this is. These are actually terms that now, genetically female, biologic little girl. These are actually used by a lot of anti-transgender activists. So terms to avoid, and also maybe terms that previously in the past were acceptable. So better options: girl, woman, boy, man, cisgender, transgender, non-binary. Now, you're going to hear folks say this, and they say, I didn't know, and that's totally okay. I would advise for yourself or anyone else that you're trying to help learn better new ways is to say, I understand we're all always learning, but the best thing you can do for our community is to understand that we have a responsibility to do better every time, right? The next is transgenders, transgender, transgendered, transgenderism, gender ideology, and quote-unquote transgender rights. So transgender is not an adjective. Or is an adjective, sorry, no. It's not a noun, okay? A transgender person is not a creature in the zoo. We do not call them that as a title or a type of thing that they are. So you don't say things like, Mal is a transgender. The parade included many transgenders. Those would be the things that you don't want to say. You don't want to capitalize transgender because it actually signifies it othering that we talked about earlier. It is an adjective that should never have an ED. The ED adds length and it causes confusion. And it also, not using it, then you include transgender in the pride, just kind of that pride nomenclature. So you have queer, you have lesbian, you have gay, you have not, transgender, right? We wouldn't say lesbianed, sorry, queered. We wouldn't say those things because they are adjectives. They describe who someone is. So instead, transgender people, a transgender person, transgender, the transgender community, the movement for transgender equality and acceptance, and equality and acceptance for people who are transgender. Now that one sounds like a lot, right? And I include it, although it is not the choices I make or the way that I think. Transgender rights to me feels very fitting, but I would say part of what folks worry about in this is that transgender rights would be new or novel for transgender people if you call them rights. So what we're doing is we're fighting for a right that transgender people already have. So that would be the difference there. So next, oh, these are some of the hardest ones. Identifies as an elder gay. I still use this to talk about myself. I use it to correct people if they say, gosh, I got mammed the other day. Totally get it. And that's what I said. I said, I totally get it. That's not how I identify, which some folks don't really use anymore. And I'm still working on myself too. Female to male, male to female, sex change, pre-op, post-op, passing, or stealth. So these are not terms that transgender people typically use. These are a lot of the words that folks will say, they stigmatize because it's really assigning being transgender to choices that you make. It's assigning being transgender to surgery or being othered, right? So that's not what we want to do. And also, we should not talk about transgender people in transition unless we are talking to them. So when we look at this, I look at all of these. These seem to be ways we would describe someone else. And really, unless we're talking to them, it's probably none of our business. So better ways: transgender woman, transgender man, transgender person, transition, or perceived as. There's one more. It's the ultimate one, which is, don't say preferred pronouns. It's not preferred, right? I understand that in this room, folks probably really understand that. But when I ask, I think a good way to do it is put it in perspective of yourself. When you think about yourself and you think about your gender, it's not a preference, right? It's who you are. So if you are a cis person and you say, well, I don't have preferred pronouns, you just have pronouns. Correct. So does everyone. So we just say pronouns. That's just what we say. This, again, the preferred pronouns, it did actually used to be a lot of the nomenclature and the verbiage that we used in the queer community, but it changes, so it's also constantly transitioning. Pretty good joke, thanks. So we're going to do a little terminology activity, which is, tell me, and you can think it, but it's helpful because if you tell me, because I can't read minds, I wish I could. But what is the correct terminology for a man who was assigned female at birth? Male. Well, yes, man. Trans man, also correct. Yeah. Transgender man, trans man, man. Great job. Folks get very confused. The words, I think, but I don't want to bring up photos of people who haven't consented to having their photos in this. So let's try this. A person with they, them pronouns. What is the correct terminology for them? Say again? Non-binary, correct. We did it. What is the correct terminology for the act of aligning one's gender expression and/or body with their gender identity through a surgical procedure? There are several terms for this. Gender confirmation, gender affirming care, absolutely. Transition, medical transition, gender affirming care. And seeking full equality of trans and non-binary people under the law. Logic, absolutely. The movement for transgender equality and acceptance. Because we already have rights, they just aren't upheld sometimes. So let's talk about the why and how. Now, I try not to be too prescriptive, but I do have some ideas, I guess. Before we get into kind of that, here's some things you can do, I want to talk about this idea of DEI and B. So I know that like diversity, equity, inclusion is just kind of thrown out there, and a lot of people think about it as like, oh, that's like a work thing, or that's like a political thing, but it really isn't. And so I think a good way is to put it in this perspective. If you think about diversity, you can think of it as reality. Diversity exists whether or not you do anything in your life. If you believe in it or not, this is a fact. Equity is a choice. We make choices every day that affect the equity of other people in our lives. So that is a choice we make. Inclusion is a practice. So the practice of inclusion means taking your choice for equity and putting that into action and making sure that the people in your life, in your community, are included, which leads to belonging, and that's the outcome. And that is that good feeling of knowing you're part of a community, that you belong, and that is the sense of safety that we can give to our trans friends and neighbors through understanding diversity as a reality, making a choice for equity, acting through inclusion, and then that's the outcome there. So why does it matter? Well, there are 1.4 million transgender adults in the US, and 43% of them live in a low to negative gender identity policy states. Now, I'm not going to get political, but it just means that inclusion matters because it impacts a lot of people, and there's still a lot of work to do. So if you think about inclusion as a practice, that is where I'm going with this. Not getting political, but understanding that your actions and the way you think and the way you include people affect others. So why do pronouns and gender identity matter? Well, if you got called the incorrect pronouns, how would you feel? If somebody purposefully did that to you as a way of making fun of you, how would you feel? If you told someone who you are and they disagreed with you based on their own ideas or beliefs, how would you feel? And you can apply it to more things than gender. You can apply it to how professional you are. You can apply it to religion. You can apply it to, you know, how smart you believe or how capable, all of these things. So it's really understanding it's an identity issue. It's not a word issue. It's an identity issue. And so using someone's pronouns is a way of saying, you told me who you are and I respect that. It also, if you use pronouns for yourself, what you're doing is helping to increase an understanding that a binary option is not the only option. And it also provides a foundation for collaboration and communication in your communities. So when I say that, what I mean is I come into a space, and every space I come into, I really need to tell people what my pronouns are, whether they tell me theirs or not, because they're going to make assumptions based on my gender expression. Now, if other people aren't sharing back with me, it really makes me feel other than, because it makes it so that, oh, identifying with your sex identified or given at birth, assigned at birth, is normal, and you are anormal, so you have to tell us why you're different. I am actually not different. I just tell people so that they can help understand. And if you also take part in this practice of sharing your pronouns when you meet people, you're going to create a sense of safety. I can tell you that sometimes I don't share my pronouns in certain spaces. I would not, for instance, go to certain places in Wyoming and correct someone who ma'amed me. I may just move on with my life because I care about my safety. But if that same person came up to me and said, hey, my name is XYZ, my pronouns are AB, I would feel very safe with that person, right? Because they're telling me they respect gender identity and I'm welcome to share with them. So some food for thought there. It's part of your identity. It gets referred to in conversation, and it's constant. And I think we take it for granted until it becomes an issue for us or for someone that we really care about. But really, it's about all of us. So what are some things you can do for gender identity inclusion? And how can you start an event or get together with gender inclusive terms? So first, trust that everyone knows their pronouns and be curious. If you don't understand she, they, say, hey, Mal, what does that mean for you? Tell me more about your gender. If I'm not comfortable, I am definitely going to say, I'm not comfortable with that, but thank you for asking. You can still use my correct pronouns. You can trust everyone knows themselves. I trust that you know yourselves. I'm not going to look at anybody and say, like, no way, that's not you. You can also use your pronouns when introducing yourself. Now, places where this is especially helpful, community spaces. Workspaces, in your families, especially when you are introducing the subject to your families. I know it's weird. One of my siblings only believes in a gender binary, but I still correct him all the time. And eventually I have faith that he'll get there, right? Because we're all constantly trying to do better. You can incorporate gender-neutral language. I'll tell you that when I moved to Nebraska, did not know that hey guys had taken over. Like, that is the number one thing. Make a mistake, don't dwell on it. So this is one thing people ask me all the time. They're like, oh, what? I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm like, please stop apologizing to me. You're making me uncomfortable. If you make a mistake, just self-correct, move forward. We all do it. I have been also kind of indoctrinated into the hey guys. So once in a while, I will use it, and then I have to correct myself. Use they, their language in writing versus he, her, right? So if it's something that someone else has written, read what they've written. But when you're thinking about addressing something to a bunch of folks, you might say they, them, pronouns. And also be respectful of others' journeys and understand that it really is hard. And it really can be very hard, but it really is hard every day. So beyond that, there is privacy and there's a journey. So I think something important to acknowledge, don't comment on someone else's appearance. Don't make assumptions. One thing that I learned is things can change every day, but not everything can change immediately. So if somebody changes something and it's a little bit different, my advice is to say nothing about it, because it's none of your business unless it's positive, right? So it's just common sense, but not that common, I would say. Getting involved outside of work. So wanted to put this in here because I study industrial organizational psychology, and a lot of it's related there. But what can you do? Oh, the number one thing is educate yourself. Learn as much as you can. And some folks like me who do trans activism or LGBTQ activism, they may be more open to talking about it, but sometimes it can be an emotional burden to constantly talk about pronouns and terms. And I think it's important to be curious and put your ego aside, but also ask questions of curiosity where someone can say, I don't really feel like talking about that. And if it's an easily accessible answer, Google it, right? Google is your friend. Raise awareness on social media. Start talking about this with your family and friends and let them know the things that you're learning. Share that information and assume, the way I assume most people don't know. And if they already know, they probably are excited to see this brought up. So I think it's great to also assume that people want to hear about this stuff and they are excited to learn it. Next, you can also shop LGBTQ-owned stores or go to their restaurants, support those individuals. For example, I get my beautiful, amazing curls cut at a salon that is owned by a now engaged lesbian couple. Very excited. And they started their own barbershop, which is also typically a very straight, hetero, male-oriented space, right? So those are the things you can seek out and support with your money. I suggest it. You can volunteer for advocacy groups. I have information I can give you just kind of about different groups. So for example, on Sunday, I went with Out Nebraska, working with Aaron and going out and doing canvassing. You can go volunteer. They are actually paying people right now, but you can go and have conversations in the community about transgender equality. And then understand legislation impact, right? So again, when you go to vote, or even when you're talking about things, or when you read about something and you're like, I don't really understand why it's a big deal, that's very important to understand. And then vote. Vote for inclusion rights, and that's inclusion for all individuals. It's very important, and I'm not going to tell you who to vote for other than for our community members. That's all I care about. I'm not a party person. I am a party person. So navigating conversations. We'll touch briefly on this, which is basically like the most common questions or the most common situations I see come up. So if a friend is having a conversation and their correct pronouns are not used, let's say I'm having a conversation with Julianne, and Julianne is like, well, I'm like, how would you not? Mal, he's the best. How would you approach this? What would you do? What would you do if you were in a group meeting or a setting like this? The answer is the same. You can easily correct that person and move on with your life. Another, how or who to ask for pronouns. Literally every person, how to ask. Hey, what are your pronouns? Hey, can you share your pronouns? Or if you don't want to ask, when you introduce yourself, tell them your pronouns. The other thing you can do to create safe space, if you've already been introduced but you realize you forgot to ask or to share, is to go, hey, Julianne, I don't know if I brought it up. My pronouns are she, they. Can you tell me what yours are? Very easy, but I think it's that ego that says, I don't know if I should ask this question. I don't want to make them feel weird. The other is, if you don't know how to approach the conversation, what do? You can ask. Ask someone you know who's part of the community or an expert, how do I do this? Or even just being very honest. I mean, honesty goes a long way, right? To say, hey, Mel, I really am curious about your pronouns. Can you tell me more? Personal questions. You need to be respectful. I know that this is kind of like a non-issue probably for most people, but I've had people ask me very strange questions. Did I used to be a man? No, thank goodness. Sorry, just kidding. I know, no, I love man. I love man. I love a man. This is because he's been sick for 3 days, which means I've been cooking a lot. Is it a question to get to know someone personally, or is it for your personal curiosity? Is asking about somebody's surgery really your business, or are you just like curious, right? And then, is it my business? You guys. So this is probably the most contentious one here in the Midwest. I don't know why folks are like very unconvinced by me about this, and that's okay. But it's just ingrained in our conversations, and all you can do is just make an effort to increase your vocabulary. Consider it a learning exercise, right? All you want to do is figure out more ways to say it. It's kind of like, instead of saying something is really good, you would say great. Instead of saying something is really good, you might say perfect. Instead of something really good, you might say delicious, right? So there are more appropriate terms depending on what you're talking about. How do you redirect this in a meeting? How do you redirect this in one-to-one conversation? It's going to depend on your comfort, but I would say this one is going to, now you're going to notice. It's going to be, I can't wait. You're going to you should get like a door counter. So tomorrow, whatever you're doing, every time somebody says you guys or hey guys or what's up guys, you can click it. I think one of the things that frames this for me is that I do social science, data analytics, and data science for a long time has been very male dominated. And so in some of the meetings I've been in when I'm working on my PhD with my cohort, somebody comes in and says, hey guys, it immediately makes me feel like I'm not part of this group anymore. Where am I and who am I and how am I considered here? Now I know that may not be the intent, but the impact for me can sometimes be very detrimental. And so I think if you can consider the way it may impact an individual in those moments, it can be super helpful. I think also, if you consider all of the different ways that gender can come up in someone's identity, saying guys can also make them feel that if it's not just your gender, if you are a transgender woman who has transitioned, how does that feel if you enter a meeting and they start with you guys? Are they pointing out, that you've transitioned? Are they making a comment about you? Are you less than? Are you discluded? It brings up a lot of questions. And I think it really is, I don't like privilege, I like the word immunity. If you aren't part of it, you're very immune to the consequences of that. And so putting yourself in someone else's shoes is really helpful. So to wrap up, a couple of things. One, there's no way to be a perfect ally. We can use the word ally. I know a lot of folks we say practice allyship, but that's not the hill I want to die on. But the transgender community is diverse and complex, coming from all over the US, all over the world, all kinds of different backgrounds, all kinds of different terminology. And you're going to encounter folks, and it's going to be a learning journey. I would tell you, I've worked with other trans and non-binary individuals across the states, and I have been corrected many, many times about different opinions and different ideas, but it's always something that is respectful. And the nicest thing someone can really do is tell you who they are and then remind you, because it means they respect you enough to make sure that you know that. You don't have to understand someone's identity to respect it. This is something that I really realized with my sibling. And the thing is, he may have a different understanding of gender on the binary. However, he does respect me as his sibling. And so, it can be very hard, but there can still be respect there even if you don't understand. Also, you can't always tell if someone is transgender by looking at them. Again, I use myself as an example. I get ma'amed, I get ma'amed all the time. I get Mrs.'d, which makes me very uncomfortable. I got Mrs. when I wasn't even wed. So, wed? Who says that? It's 1807. Yeah, wed. You're wed, Mrs. And there's no one right way. Some people transition medically, some people don't. Some people change their name or their IDs, some people don't. Some people literally are transgender and change nothing about themselves other than telling you who they are, and that's good too. You may change your clothes or your hair, you might not. It may happen today, it may happen 20 years from now. You may also learn more about yourself and you may transition back. There are many, many different things that happen in the journey, and there's no two journeys that are alike, and that's why it's so important to respect everybody as an individual. All right, so that's my material, and I want to open it up for Q&A. If anybody has questions. Oh, I did so good on time. I was very nervous about it. I tend to go long. Thank you. You're very nice. So questions, or any questions in the meeting chat also. Yeah, I've got chat up here. So far, nobody's asked any questions. That's okay. She must be perfect. Well, I mean, look at me, but also, I have some questions that people have asked me that I can answer on the fly too, because I think some of them may be questions people have that they just don't want to, ask in this group. So, yeah, what's your question? So when you're changing it legally, where do you start? Where does that start? Yeah, it's very, very hard, and it depends on where you are. So state to state, it will be different. I think especially in the next election cycle, because the legality and the respect of transgender and non-binary individuals is different based on legislation, based on whomever at the time is leading that. But a good way to do it is to start honestly with your doctor and learning more about what it means for you and the way that you're feeling about your gender identity. So I talked to my primary care provider first and then started meeting with a psychologist to understand more of what was going on with me. That's my ongoing work now, but if I wanted to work on that in any legal form, I may have to move. It would depend. It can be very hard. Yeah. Yeah, it depends. I think the easiest is, or maybe the most accessible, it's not easy, changing your name, which I know that you can effectively change your name. And actually out Nebraska does name change clinics in Lincoln and in Omaha. And so you can meet with them or you can attend. I think they do them virtually and in person, so you can always learn more there. But I think that's a great starting point in Nebraska at least. Yeah, I'm sorry. So the question was about gender-affirming legal support. Yes, and there are. So there are lots of organizations for transgender people across the United States. And the best way to get started there is to connect with your resources locally, and they can help you identify those individuals. So if you are someone practicing allyship or a family member, PFLAG is a great organization that is here and in Omaha, and then also out in Nebraska. So what you want to do is not, I know I said Google it, don't Google it. Find your local resources, because also, those folks are going to be very connected, and they're going to know who to trust. So a lot of this is about trust. It's about trusting who you go to with who you are, because depending on the legislation and how things shake out, it can really change things. So for example, different legislation in Lincoln at the city level has been brought forward and walked back and brought forward about employment protection for transgender individuals and LGBTQ individuals. And so sometimes it can be very nerve-wracking to just out yourself to a firm, trying to get information. So it's good to go through those resources that are tried and true. Yeah. 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 So I think there's a few things, and they are hard to come to grips with. So I was shuffling through these papers. The question was, how do you have conversations with folks who don't understand transgender family members, or we say conservative folks, but sometimes you'd be surprised. So I think there's a few things that you may have to settle with yourself. And one is sometimes you have to let folks go, which for me was like very hard letting friends go. But beyond that, there's education. And you can have these conversations with folks. There's a lot of books out there. There are groups. I would say also like PFLAG, for example. They provide support to friends and family members of LGBTQ individuals. And they help understand, they help facilitate those conversations. I would say that a lot of what I think, what's the best phrasing? Humanizing this situation is probably going to be the most effective. So I think that they're a human, if you were. Yeah. So humanizing, and then that was kind of, for me, was the decision point of, beyond helping convince you that I'm a human and I'm a whole person, having to make decisions with myself. And honestly, sometimes even the impact of that for them was kind of the changing moment, where they were maybe more convinced, which is, I think, the most difficult thing. I don't want to convince anybody to accept anybody. I don't really believe in the word tolerance, right? I don't tolerate anybody. I accept people, even when they're terrible, right? I accept, well, you want to do that? That's who you are. That's okay. And so part of that, too, for me, from my experience, was understanding that. In my experience working with my sibling on understanding this, it's an ongoing conversation, and it's not great. But there's a choice that I haven't made there that I'm not prepared to make because of my family ties. And so I think it may come down to belief. So my deep intrinsic belief is that people can do better, and the more time that you give them, the better they are to learn and do better themselves. And that, I think, is also very hard, because I would appreciate it if years ago I was fully accepted, but we haven't gotten there yet. But that's okay. He's also, if he wants to be that way, accept that. It's his loss, honestly. I don't know if that was helpful, but yeah, it's definitely hard. I've had other folks approach me that, and they're like, I don't even know if I can, maintain these friendships even if there's someone not in my family, and it can be really hard. But the human impact, I would say, is helpful. Yeah. I think something that's helpful is the idea of approaching with curiosity, and then also, even though it doesn't always prove out to be true, but the thought of assuming good intent. So I try to approach conversations with folks with questions. Tell me more of why you're confused about this. Tell me what is making you feel this way about this situation. And then also assuming good intent, like maybe it's misunderstanding, maybe we can get somewhere. And then explaining that human component, which is what we all are, who we are in the inside, I think can be very helpful. There is an element of patience. Honestly, yeah, I have not always had, but I am not confrontational. It's just not the way that I approach my life. And so, there is a lot of self-control that I have to exercise and just keep asking questions and trying to have those conversations. And I know it's hard. Yeah. It's really interesting you bring this up because I was listening to NPR on the way over here, and they were talking about that. And a doctor, the way that they approached, so I know that we can't hear. In the healthcare system, doctors can have a hard time with sex assigned at birth and gender identity, which I've encountered. And the way that this person was talking about it in the radio program I was just listening to, which is something I already thought is, I'm not just meat, right? I'm not just a person. And if you want to take really good holistic care of me as a physician, you need to know all of the details about me that you can get to take care of me and to help me. And that includes how I feel, who I am, and the body that I have. It's all of those things. And I just thought the way that they put that was like so point. To me, I was always like, I'm not just like meat. I know it can be really hard for physicians, but I think also the question asking that you were just talking about is exactly what I was referring to, right? So asking those questions with curiosity, what is the challenge here? I mean, if somebody said that to me, I would say that makes so much sense. I understand and respect that. But what about mental, emotional health, right? How does the way that I feel about my gender and myself impact that? Because are you taking care of me if you aren't including the whole picture of who I am? So I think it's a great start, but yeah, definitely I know that it's hard. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't have them like available right now, but I'm going to send a follow-up to Julianne and she can circulate that to you. But there's a lot, and I think people don't necessarily know, but I think right now is going to be very important because, and I try not to get political, but the election cycle that's coming up, this part of our identities has been politicized, and so we have to operate in that environment until someday it's not anymore, and then we can all just go back to arguing about oil or whatever. That's fine. That sounds great to me. But yeah, I'll send that along. I would say the two organizations that I really try to work with pretty consistently are Out Nebraska and PFLAG. There's also the Trevor Project, which is really great organization, and then they always need support for different resources for individuals who are contemplating suicide. So in the interest of our conversation tonight, did not do a lot of conversation around that. Wanted to focus on gender and pronouns and how do we get there and increasing that understanding. But that is the negative impact, is that these folks who aren't accepted really need that support. And a lot of, when you look at those organizations that run that kind of life-saving support, those are a lot of the folks that they work with. So really essential, and I'll make sure I send that along to Julianne. And I'm sorry I didn't repeat the question. No, that's okay. Okay. I think I said resources, so maybe we got the... That's nice. Oh, I'm sorry, I went over time. Julianne, what are your pronouns?
She, her.
Oh, thank you for sharing.
Well, I just want to thank you all for joining us tonight. Again, Out Nebraska, PFLAG. Those are great ways for you to educate yourself on the spectrum and have those comfortable conversations with everyone around you. Again, thanks for Mal for coming in and giving such a great presentation. I think that each time you enter into that conversation, you get more comfortable with it. And to understand that we're just human, right? And to respect that person as a human being. And that's where you start from. So, again, thanks for being with us.